Alright, so we left off last Tuesday, and we talked about the idea of compound conditions. So, in your textbook, compound conditions look at, or begin on page 74, and they start looking at this idea of how do we combine conditions. So oftentimes we have multiple conditions that we need to have happen. So, come down here, cursor. So we may find that to be a fully registered student at Peru, you have to be admitted and you have to be registered for classes. In other words, both parts of that condition. So when we use an and, both parts have to be true. Now, maybe we define a student at Peru as somebody who is admitted or they're registered for class. So ors become true when either part is true. We also have the not. So not means is true, and that results in a true. And I know that seems a little confusing, but when we start looking at that, you'll see what we're looking at. So one of the interesting things we can do, and that not becomes very useful, is if I want to encourage a user to put into some kind of content. So let's set up a couple of things. So let's do user name. So we're going to request a username from somebody. Maybe it's our password program. And we're going to first set it equal to a null. So in other words, anything that we have in there, we're setting our sentinel values. And then I'm going to use a while statement. While not username. So what we're doing there, and what this lets us do, is this loop, so whatever's inside of here, so in this particular case we're going to use a username equals input. That will loop around, and if you try to enter in just a null character, so you just hit the enter key, it's actually going to loop through there. So this while not just says that as long as they haven't put any value in there, that loop will execute. So that's kind of a handy thing that we utilize. So nots are very handy, ands. So those logical Boolean things we looked at in the logic text, now we're going to implement actually in the real world. So on page 74, there is this program for exclusive computer network. And I'm going to open that. And I'm going to open it in the, well, apparently for whatever reason I can't open it in the idle environment, but I will here in a second. So if I enter in, and notice as long as I just keep hitting enter until I actually put in a value, it just keeps looping that for that password. So again, it's kind of a handy, useful tool. So let me open up Python. The idle environment, so for whatever reason it's on this particular computer. I have to do it this way, so file, open. And I'm going to go to the desktop. So this particular program is pretty short. So let's take a look at it and what it's doing and why it works. So that while that I showed you, while not username, just allows you to create a loop. We do the same thing with the password. And then we have a set of if and elifs to see if you happen to be one of the people we're looking for. Now, the sheer reality is this is interesting, but we would certainly put usernames in a little different structure and not hide them just in our code where they're visible. But it shows you the power of what we can do with these operators. So on page 78, we look at the AND operator. So let's look at this particular line. So if username equals mdawson and the password equals secret, then it's going to print out a statement that says, "Hi, Mike." It's going to change the security level. We have the next line down, so we're creating ANDs. So both this piece has to be equal and this piece has to be equal for this to run. In other words, we're not going to print out "Hi Mike" if only M. Dawson is entered and he doesn't put in the password correctly. So ANDs require both portions to run. ORs require something a little different. So if we want to put in the word guest, so I'll look down here a little further. So we have a guest password or password guest. So notice here we put an OR in. So if either we have guest as a username or guest as a password, then it will actually execute that. So let's look at that and run it. So we're going to run. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to put in and guest. And notice it runs that code. Well, that's interesting. So I'm going to run that again. And I'm going to do, let me get that back in the recording window. And I'm going to do guest first. And notice it also works. Because it with that OR statement in there, either condition makes it true to allow that loop to operate. So one of the keys is to create everything in pseudocode or to draw out a diagram. How am I going to work this? So as our programs get harder and harder and harder, you're going to need to be able to break it down into manageable chunks. So our book talks about something called stepwise refinement on page 81. Make sure you've read that. We need to be able to break down a program into smaller and smaller pieces. So the author talks about pseudocode on the bottom of page 81. So there's a couple of things that we're going to do. So in this particular case, he looks at how do we examine the random number program. So, in his particular example, planning the game. Well, if we're going to create a guess my number game, so in other words, we create a random number and you get to guess. So, the pseudocode he created there at the bottom of page 81, pick a number, let the player guess essentially, and repeat that action, and congratulate the player. So, in that first issue, we have a very, very short set of pseudocode, and it tells us the gist of the program, but we can then expand that so that we get more and more of the details in there. So, I like using something like Notepad, just as my little guess. So, at the end of your chapter are some challenges. So The first challenge is the one I'm going to look at. So it says, write a program that simulates a fortune cookie. The program should display one of 5 unique fortunes at a random time it's run. Okay, so my pseudocode starts with this idea. So now, in pseudocode, you tend to use the slashes. You can go ahead and use the, if you'd like to. It doesn't really matter. So what we're going to do is, this is a program so we start with the idea of, we know that we're going to display a random cookie. We have 5 choices. So the first thing we know we're going to have to do is, if we're going to use those random functions, well, we know that we're going to have to do something with that. So let's think about this. So introduce program to user. We then look at, we know we need to pick a random number, because that's how we're going to then assign which link we're going to use, from 1 to 5 if we have 5 statements. And then we're going to output corresponding value. End program. So we made it a little more detailed. And then as we start to look at this, we know that, well, if I'm going to use, so I know I need to import the random library. I know that I'm going to have a set of, so I'm going to have this output. We can expand that. We know that we can use our if and elifs to create a set of outputs. So in other words, we could do an if random number equals 1, output and we could do an elif your lottery numbers are 1, 3, 5. Alright, so back to where we were with our program. So we could then write one very easily, taking this information. So we know we would have to do a couple of things. And we can look at those files that we already have existing. And a lot of times we can get information out of them. So if I look at this unzipped folder, I might well find one that looks somewhat similar to what I want to do. So that craps roller might give us some information. Yeah, I can't open it directly there. Hang on a second. Where's idle? Let me open. So I could look at this particular program, for example, and so I could go File, New. Now I have another window open. So now that I've got my pseudocode written, I can look at it, and I know that I'm going to use some of these same things. So I'm going to import random, and I'm going to generate some random numbers. So I might even copy this piece over. I might come up here and say program to generate fortune cookie. Now, we know that we're going to actually only generate numbers from 1 to 5. So we're going to change that just a little bit. And then in this program, notice we can get the information, so we could do something like cookie equals. So notice over here, let me make it a little smaller. The method I would most likely use is this method we used in die number 1. So we have random. So we're calling that random library, rand integer. And then we want that range. So 1, 5. Great. So can we get any other information out of there? So we know cookie is equal to now the number 1 through 5. Okay. So at some point, we can do an else, or an if, excuse me. Okay. So if I want an example of how an if statement might work, let me open. Remember where we did the mood computer. Okay, so look at this example. So all these pieces. So we're going to copy something very similar to this structure that's in here then. So if cookie, and remember we have to use a double equals 1, then print, and remember print's a function, you will have a good day. Okay, so I can then do an elif, so we get another elif cookie equal 2, and give us a second the winning so we can come up with all kinds of statements in there. Now, because those elifs are going to be very similar, I can cheat. I guess that's print, not pring, for some reason. So I could cheat here, and I like to copy and paste. So I'm going to Control C for copy. I'm going to paste. And so I can change those to 3, 4. Now, my fifth one then becomes very similar to this. In my else statement then, else print pick 1, 3, 5 in the lottery. So I'd want to go back up and edit those statements. And then I almost always end my programs. Get rid of my white space there. With that universal input. Hold on, let me put that to the, take out the, and that way that holds that program open. Now I've created that entire program to solve that issue of the cookie problem And what I did was I reused code, I looked at existing code. So use those examples that are in that folder. What happens when I run this? Well, let's see. Okay, so we're going to save it to something. I'll save it on the desktop. Invalid syntax. All right. So somewhere in there we have an issue. And so we'll have to go figure out what that is. Close that shell out. Close this one, get some of this stuff out of the way here. So even though we just created this, you are going to run into problems and issues, and most of the time it's something silly. Now when I look at this code, I notice something strange. I didn't close a quote mark, and that can be enough to cause us an issue. So in this particular case, we have some kind of an issue with that phrase cookie. Well, we can do some checking, and we can try to narrow down what that issue might be. So, is it that extra space? So we can run it. Invalid syntax, and it still doesn't like that phrase cookie. So occasionally we run into things with reserved words. So maybe we need to do something a little strange. So you'll notice up here under the controls, there's a ton of different options. So one of the things I can do, so if I'm worried that I've created a reserved word, and there are a few of them, I can find cookie, and I can replace it with X. And that way we change our variable. So replace and find all of them. And notice what it did to our text. So let's see if that solves our problem, or do we have another issue in our coding here? So invalid syntax. And it comes up pretty quickly. So maybe we need to look at our if statement. Did we do something odd with our if statement? And so again, one of the tools we have here is we might want to look at those items we have existing, and we can compare our work with known programs that run. Now you may see the error right away. Let me see if I can open that up again. So let's open up. And let's look at the guess my number program. So that one has examples, but I don't see anything that directly looks like the issue that we're having. So invalid syntax. So generator. So at some point we have an issue with that if statement. So why and what is the issue? Did we import random? We did. So one of the things we can do is put in a print statement. We can run. So we could get it to export that. So, what is wrong with the if statement? That causes it to be an issue. So, we can compare these two. So, notice what happened. A simple capital I can cause our program not to run. So now I'm going to run it. So print is not defined. So my guess is, when I look at this, notice that it's not highlighted in color. So all of my keywords will have some kind of highlighting, and that'll give me a clue on some way to check my code. You will have a good day. So it picked number 1. We can run it again. And it picked number 4. So your program, you have to create the simulation of flipping a set of dice multiple times. Well, we can get a random number. If we put that inside of a loop, for example, we could flip that multiple times. And we need to figure out some way then to increment those variables so we can keep track of whether it's zeros or whether it's ones. So that's the challenge we leave you with this week. You have all the tools available. Make sure you work on it, try it. If you get really stumbled, one of the keys that I will tell you is to walk away for a few minutes. Come back and then look at it. Are my variable names, are they the same? Are my functions, do I have them all in lowercase? Have I done anything silly? Are they highlighted correctly? All right. I wish everybody a great weekend. If you get completely stumped, send me an email or post on the Instructors Corner. But I am hopeful that everybody can figure out how to flip dice. And again, we're making that Monte Carlo simulation from statistics of simulating the flipping of multiples of dice. And if I can get it to do it for 100 coin flips, I can simulate 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 coin flips.